Let me, just before I start, I would like to just pass on my appreciation, the appreciation of the...
Imagine a country that has lived in the shadow of its giant neighbor for decades, a country for which every move by the White House meant a new economic course, a new price for steel, new rules of the game. Now imagine that this neighbor is slamming the door again, imposing new tariffs, tearing up agreements, and demanding submission. But this time, things are not going according to plan. This time, Canada is not responding with anger. It is responding with silence.
Entire Canadian delegation to our Malaysian hosts, particularly Dr. Ibrahim, the Prime Minister, for an extraordinary group of meetings, extraordinary hospitality, which is going to continue for the next few hours this evening.
When Donald Trump announced new tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, the world expected the usual reaction: retaliatory measures, loud statements, diplomatic threats. But the Canadian Prime Minister chose a different path. Instead of striking back, he flew to Asia. No loud words, no tweets, no hysteria. He said only one thing: Canada is ready to talk when the United States is ready to listen. In Washington, it sounded like a challenge, because calmness is not weakness, it is strategy. It was at this moment that one of the most unexpected economic transformations of modern times began. What started as a trade conflict quickly turned into a turning point for an entire nation. While Trump repeatedly used tariffs as a weapon, the world stopped fearing his threats. Stock markets no longer tremble at his statements, and investors have learned to live with his unpredictability. What once seemed shocking has become just another day in the news. Meanwhile, something much quieter but much more significant was happening in Ottawa. In 2025, for the first time in decades, the Canadian budget focused not on foreign trade but on domestic strength. Hundreds of billions of dollars were directed toward the development of clean energy, industry, and infrastructure. U.S. tariffs, which stifled exports, inadvertently triggered a process of domestic revival. And when Washington closed one door, Canada opened another. To the east, Asia, the ASEAN summit, negotiations with Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea. While America is sinking into a policy of isolation, Canada is building a network of new partnerships. A new economic geography is taking shape before our eyes, where Ottawa is no longer dependent on a single market. But this story is not about numbers or trade balances. It is about character.
You know, from our perspective, a highly productive few days at the ASEAN summit here in Kuala Lumpur. I've been joined by a delegation, including our Minister of International Trade, and we have focused on building new partnerships and unlocking new economic opportunities.
When companies like General Motors and Stellantis announced they were winding down production in Ontario, thousands of workers lost confidence in the future. It seemed like defeat, but instead of anger, something else emerged: determination. The government set up a crisis team, unions entered into negotiations, and society rallied around the idea that we would not back down. Today, Canada is on the verge of a historic turning point. America speaks the language of pressure. Canada speaks the language of confidence. America threatens with tariffs. Canada responds with investments. And in this silence, in this calm, a new power is born. Because in an era when everyone is shouting, the one who speaks calmly sounds louder than everyone else. This is the story of how a country that was being pushed to the wall learned to stand tall. It is a story about how calmness became a weapon, and about why, right now, Canada can become a new force in the global economy. When Donald Trump announced a new increase in tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, it looked like another episode of an old series that everyone had already seen. For Washington, it was a show of strength. For Ottawa, it was a repeat of the pain. But this time, things turned out differently. Tired of endless threats, Canada did not respond in the usual way. There were no mirror tariffs, no loud statements about national grievances, no demonstrative political gestures. Instead, the Prime Minister appeared before the cameras calmly, almost coldly, saying only, "We will be ready for dialogue when they are ready to listen."
That will benefit Canadian workers and their businesses. Nous sommes réunis ici à un moment à la fois crucial et rempli d'opportunités. Le monde est devenu plus dangereux et divisé.
These words sounded like a diplomatic formula, but in fact, it was a strategy to wait, to let the opponent run out of steam. The reason for the new wave of trade conflict was not an economic decision, but, as analysts claimed, personal resentment. It all started when a television commercial appeared in Ontario using an archived speech by Ronald Reagan from 1987 condemning protectionism and tariffs. American television channels picked up the story. Donald Trump called the commercial fake, declared that Canada was manipulating American heritage, and literally within a day ordered his trade representative to suspend all negotiations on a new agreement on steel and aluminum. It seemed like a typical outburst of his usual impulsiveness, but the consequences turned out to be much deeper. Ottawa saw this move not just as economic pressure, but as a test of resilience. The last few months of negotiations were almost complete. According to Bloomberg, an agreement was being prepared that could remove the 10% tariff and introduce a quota system to protect both sides. In an instant, everything collapsed. However, instead of complaining or seeking a compromise at any cost, the Canadian government chose silence and methodicalness.
Le système de commerce mondial est en train de changer de manière fondamentale. L'évolution technologique et la transition énergétique s'accélèrent à un rythme sans précédent.
The Prime Minister left the country and headed to Asia for a summit that the American side did not even consider important. This decision encapsulated the essence of the new line. If the U.S. closes one door, you need to open another. Canada's quiet diplomacy proved more powerful than loud slogans. In Washington, the reaction to Ottawa's restraint was mixed. Some officials admitted that it felt like a cold shower, while others saw it as a threat, not external but symbolic. After all, where hysteria was expected, confidence was heard, and this undermined the very logic of pressure. After all, blackmail only works if the opponent is afraid. Analysts note that this was not just a matter of keeping up appearances, but a well-thought-out strategy. In recent years, the Canadian economy has taken a step toward internal, self-sufficient growth. Back in 2024, the federal government launched an industrial restart program, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in clean energy, critical mineral processing, and the development of new industries in Ontario and Quebec. What used to be called a retaliatory measure has now become the basis of policy.
L'ancien ordre mondial est revenu. Et même si le Canada a prospéré dans ce système, nous savons que la nostalgie n'est pas une stratégie. C'est pourquoi nous traçons une nouvelle voie à suivre pour notre pays.
In the 2025 Canadian budget, the share of investment in infrastructure and green technologies grew by almost 28%. And when Trump closed the trade negotiations, Canada's economy was already standing on its own 2 feet. But it wasn't just about the numbers. It was a battle for psychological leadership. While the American president used threats as a political tool, the Canadian government used patience as a weapon. The international media called this style economic zen. A phrase coined by the Guardian journalists quickly became a meme. Canada's silence is louder than American sanctions. And there was a point to it. Each new tariff from Washington was no longer perceived as a blow, but as a predictable event. The markets stopped panicking. Bloomberg analysts even started tracking the Trump index in a graph showing how much White House statements affect currency and stock fluctuations. In 2025, this index fell to a historic low. For Canada, this was a victory in terms of perception. The Prime Minister was able to turn the economic crisis into a tool for the country's political maturation. Ottawa no longer saw itself as a junior partner waiting for Washington's approval. At a press conference in Toronto, which was quoted by global media outlets, he said Canada will not play by anyone else's rules. We will create our own. Although the phrase seemed like an emotional outburst, within the government it was perceived as a manifesto for a new era, an era of independence based not on confrontation, but on strategic autonomy. It was then that the idea of building within the country was born, a simple but powerful formula that unites economics and politics, not just developing industry, but building a holistic system that does not depend on political upheavals overseas.
On November 4th, our government will table the first federal budget, our first federal budget. And that'll be our plan to protect our communities, our borders, our way of life. Our plan to build a stronger economy where everyone has a chance to get ahead. And our plan to empower Canadians with new opportunities, better careers, and a lower cost of living. Central to those missions,
programs to modernize metallurgy, mechanical engineering, and clean energy became a national priority. In Quebec, construction began on North America's largest lithium processing plant for electric vehicle batteries. In Ontario, a project was launched to create a network of small industrial parks, bringing together startups and large corporations. These steps not only created jobs, they sent a signal to investors. Canada is no longer waiting for mercy from global markets. Interestingly, in parallel with this internal construction, the external rhetoric has also changed. The Minister of Foreign Affairs emphasized that the answer to tariffs is not retaliatory tariffs, but growth. This statement was a turning point. It defined a new philosophy. Economics as diplomacy, investment as defense. While the White House measured success by the number of tariffs imposed, Canada measured its success by the number of new factories. Subsequent events only reinforced this line. In the 9 months following the announcement of the tariffs, foreign investment in Canadian manufacturing grew by 14%, especially in sectors affected by U.S. restrictions. Companies from Germany, South Korea, and Japan began to transfer their contracts to Canadian jurisdiction to avoid tariff risks in the U.S.
Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
Even some American firms, tired of Washington's unpredictability, began opening branches north of the border. Of course, not everything was perfect. Some economists warned that the focus on domestic investment could lead to an overheated labor market and a growing shortage of skilled workers. But the political effect was obvious. For the first time in decades, Canadians felt that their country had its own trajectory. Thus began the second stage, a rethinking of Canada's role in world trade. Ottawa realized that if the old rules were breaking down, new ones had to be written, and to do so not in Washington, but in Tokyo, Jakarta, and Seoul. This is where the diversification policy was born, which would later turn into a large-scale program of trade agreements.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
With Asia, but before Canada turned to the east, it strengthened its rear. As a result, the first and second stages, the escalation of the conflict and internal consolidation, became a mirror for the whole world. America tried to prove that volume is power. Canada proved that power is stability. And while the White House was shouting about victory, Ottawa was quietly building the future. The irony was that the tariffs, designed to weaken Canada, became the catalyst for its industrial revival. In an economy where everything is measured by reaction speed, Canada chose endurance. In a world where decisions are made in the heat of the moment, it chose patience. And in this calmness lies its revolution. While Washington continued to talk about a national victory and bringing jobs back to America, Ottawa was already charting a new course. Quiet, methodical, almost invisible on the surface.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
After the steel and aluminum negotiations collapsed and the U.S. market effectively shut down, Canada made a decision that changed not only its foreign policy, but also the very logic of its existence in the global economy. Whereas Ottawa had always acted as a northern partner dependent on the impulses of the White House, it now decided to become an independent player. And the first step was to turn to Asia. The Prime Minister's trip to Malaysia looked like a diplomatic gesture, but in fact, it was a signal of a global shift. At the ASEAN summit, the Canadian delegation presented a strategy that was dubbed Pacific Pivot North by the Western media. The essence was simple: a reorientation toward markets where stability and growth are more important than political slogans. It was not a sharp break with the U.S., but it was a clear hint that Canada no longer intends to be held hostage by American trade policy. Within a few months, negotiations began with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore on new agreements for the supply of critical minerals: lithium, copper, and nickel. Reports from the Ministry of Industry stated that these contracts could provide up to 40% of exports by 2027, which had previously depended on American orders. This strategy coincided with growing demand for clean technology and green energy in Asia. While the U.S. was bogged down in disputes over subsidies and localization of production, Canada offered what the region so desperately needed: reliability.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
In Tokyo and Seoul, Canadian officials presented their country not just as a supplier of raw materials, but as a partner capable of building supply chains from extraction to processing. Even China, which was in deep conflict with Washington at the time, cautiously welcomed Ottawa's initiative. The Chinese newspaper Global Times published an article titled "Canada, the Quiet Alternative," which noted that in an era of American unpredictability, Canada's stability could become a new factor in world trade. Psychological changes played no less of a role. For Canadian businesses, Asia was no longer a distant place. Banks and investment funds began actively opening offices in Singapore and Hong Kong. According to data published in a TD Securities report, Canadian investment in Asian projects grew by almost 35% in the first 9 months of 2025. On the stock exchanges, this was called the calm effect. Investors fled from the turbulence in the U.S. to places where the rules of the game were at least understandable. It was at this moment that it became clear that Trump's strategy, based on threats and trade pressure, had begun to work against the United States itself.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
They don't allow our banks, and you know that Canada does not allow banks to go in.
The new tariff on Canadian goods, introduced in the spring of 2025, was supposed to strengthen the U.S. domestic market but instead it became a source of systemic losses. American farmers faced rising equipment prices, auto parts manufacturers faced metal shortages, and grain exporters faced falling demand. According to the U.S. National Association of Manufacturers, in mid-2025, more than 60% of medium-sized companies reported delivery delays and revisions to their investment plans. No one in Washington expected the effect to be so devastating. The loss of investor confidence hit the American economy, where it hurt most, its sense of control. Once upon a time, every statement Trump made caused market fluctuations and instant concessions from partners. Now, those same words had the opposite effect. Financial analysts even joked that the louder the White House speaks, the higher the Canadian dollar rises. In July 2025, the Canadian currency rose above 0.82 to the US dollar for the first time in 5 years, symbolizing not only economic stability, but also a moral victory. This loss of influence did not go unnoticed. The European media began to talk about how the world was getting used to life without American dominance. Germany and France, observing the conflict with Canada, began to use the same principles, strengthening domestic production and seeking new partners in Asia. And for Canada, this became a window of opportunity.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
In 2025, the country entered the top 5 largest investors in infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia for the first time, overtaking even Australia. Against the backdrop of this rift in economic relations, Trump continued to use strong rhetoric. His supporters argued that tariffs were a tool of pressure that would ultimately force allies to give in. But it turned out that fear no longer worked. Bloomberg conducted a survey among international investors. 72% of respondents said they perceived U.S. trade policy as a factor of instability. When pressure becomes a habit, it loses its edge, and that is exactly what happened with America. And meanwhile, Canada was gradually strengthening its presence in new markets. As part of agreements with Malaysia and Vietnam, joint ventures were established to produce components for renewable energy. In Indonesia, preparations began for the launch of the region's largest copper concentrate processing complex with Canadian capital. Ottawa signed a mutual investment protection agreement with South Korea, and a meeting was held in Tokyo at which Japanese companies confirmed their readiness to expand battery production in joint ventures with Canadian lithium suppliers. All this was happening against the backdrop of the United States losing ground even among its own G7 partners. As a result, a new logic began to emerge on the global stage. Countries tired of American pressure were looking for an alternative and found it in Canada.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
This contrast was a symbolic turning point of the era. The U.S. continued to act according to the logic of confrontation, as if the whole world still depended on its decisions. But in recent years, the world has changed. And with it, Canada has changed. It no longer tried to be just the best neighbor. It became an example of how soft power based on trust can be more powerful than any tariffs. Economists called it the Carney effect, a quiet revolution in economic policy, where stability and composure replaced outbursts and threats. While Trump tried to prove that pressure creates influence, Canada proved that influence creates stability. And perhaps that is why, at the end of 2025, when the White House once again announced new tough measures against foreign manufacturers, most markets reacted not with a fall, but with apathy. The world had stopped fearing Washington, and that was perhaps the most resounding consequence of the trade war. Tariffs, conceived as a tool of domination, became the cause of its loss. And in this paradox, Canada found its new role, not as an antagonist, not as an opposition, but as an alternative. When loud words cease to carry weight, silence becomes the new language of power.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
When news broke in Ontario in the fall of 2025 that General Motors was closing its electric van production in Ingersoll and Stellantis was moving Jeep Compass assembly to Illinois, the country froze for a moment. These businesses were not just workshops and assembly lines. They symbolized the industrial soul of Canada. Generations of families worked there, building cars that were shipped across the continent. The loss of more than 4,000 jobs in a single week seemed to herald a new crisis. However, the government's response was unusual for such situations. Instead of desperate accusations or promises of immediate compensation, the Prime Minister said, "We will not allow decisions made under tariff pressure to destroy our industrial foundation.